This presentation is really going to take sort of a historical underpinning of what I just kind of wanted to share some thoughts with you of what I thought would be helpful as we navigate our new identity. And I think one of the key phrases that Linnell mentioned is that I sort of phrase of the day. I thought we were done. Where'd all the hippies go? I was reminded when you said that, Linnell, about a board meeting that I was in fairly recently over the past year. And one of the people said, I didn't realize that we had not finished the work. I thought the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion had been done, particularly around race. And until this race reconciliation, this inflection point that the country has been thrust toward happen, this person said that he had no idea that things were as bad as they are. And so I just want to pause to let you know that I'm going to be sharing some ideas. Some of this will be historical. And if you got questions that you'd like to ask, please jot them down. I am a native of, just to give you a little bit about myself, I'm from New York, spent time in North Carolina. Father's from Jamaica. Father was a Republican. Mother was a Democrat. I have mastered the tension of opposites. And so I am often in that space where I am negotiating, navigating, and facilitating conversations that are tough. And so as I think about that, I want you to know that some of the stuff that I'm going to be sharing might be be a little challenging to hear. And I think that it's an opportunity to ask questions that are curious and that are thoughtful and that help us move forward as we consider where we are now. And so the League of Women Voters, as your president or your CEO mentioned, Virginia Case, she mentioned how much work that you all have been doing, that empowering voters and defending democracy, and that you have been on the job doing this day in and day out. You're fighting voter suppression, you're fighting money in politics, and you're talking about redistricting. And I have a true confession to make. When I think about things like fighting for voter suppression and money in politics and redistricting, it really sort of hurts to think that we are in this place where being human isn't enough. Well, I can be a little idealistic and understand the philosophical mandate and underpinning, about which this country was founded. It really saddens me to think about how far we've come, but how far we have to go. Because I think that if you're human and you're a citizen of a country, that you should have an unfettered access, an uncategorical right to choose your leaders, period. And so when we talk about fighting, right, fighting voter suppression, and feels like we've been fighting for a long time, right? We've been fighting for voter suppression and money in politics and all of these issues that are not soon going to go away. That doesn't mean we should back up from the fight. There are so many issues that are confronting us today related to voter suppression. And not only are people like Stacey Abrams and God rest John Lewis's soul, and so many people in Congress working hard to push back on these inhumane bills that that Case mentioned, your CEO mentioned. There are so many others whose names that we cannot call, who we do not know. And some folks right here on this Zoom meeting that are fighting for the right for people to have access to vote and to get rid of the disenfranchisement of voters all across this country. And so when we talk about where we've been, part of what I wanted to make sure that we understand, and many of you probably do in some ways, I think going through this, I'll be preaching to the choir, but nevertheless, we're going to be in on one accord as we walk through this, that this that the League was traditionally about white women. And so as Black women, and as you grow and as you change, and as we even think about our politics being local, I love what Linnell said when she talked about look at your associates, look at your friends, and invite them to the table. Because as Black women, and as allies that are out there, we are all in this together. And I think sometimes it bears reminding that we have not, as certainly as women of color, been included in this fight, and not even in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed, where we necessarily granted the unfettered access. And as you see, these rights are so tender, because look at where we are now. Ruth Gesser, a small business owner, said, I believe women are a strong political force, and the League has been supporting that for close to 100 years. And I think that that's absolutely true. Not only these women, but some other women that I'm going to share with you. One of the things that I shared a little earlier is I am sort of a researcher, an ethnographer. I love talking to people. I'm curious. I want to know whose stories. So I like to talk about people's stories. And so in doing that this year, I interviewed my aunt, who you will not find in the history books. She was born in 1927. The first PhD in America granted to a Black woman was in 1921. I believe her name is Georgina Simmons. I think I've got her one of her slides in here. But my aunt's 96-year-old journey was so powerful. May Rose, we called her Aunt May Rose. And one of the things that I did, and I wanted to capture, and I encourage you to think about what it means to capture your oldest living relative. And if you know the age of your oldest living relative, I encourage you to drop it in the chat. So May Rose was 96 when we had this interview earlier this year. And I asked her many, many questions. One of the questions I asked her was, in 1965, Aunt May Rose, did you vote? And she says, I voted for the very first president that I had the right to vote for. And I said, do you remember that first time? And she said, yes, I do, kind of like it was yesterday. And so it occurred to me that this fight has happened on so many levels, that those of us who've had relatives who were not out there as active suffragettes who were fighting, they were also fighting in their own way. And so I went on to say, Aunt May Rose, what was it like raising kids? And she says, Dina, that's my family name. It was hard. And then I said, so what was so hard about it? And she says, I didn't really have the help that I need. And it occurred to me, because my brain makes all of these disparate connections sort of constantly, that the systematic dismantling of families for women, particularly Black women, started in the fields. And because she didn't have, he had a husband, but he wasn't really there to help her, because their lives were about work. And she says, I worked so hard. I picked 100 bales of cotton, 100 pounds of cotton a day. After picking my lip off the floor, I could not believe it, that she worked and picked, she said, 2 rows are about 100 pounds. So I went on to ask her questions, and there are a couple of other questions that I asked. I said, Aunt May Rose, where were you? Because now I'm thinking you're a freedom fighter in your own way. You're just doing it differently. You're doing the role that you were called to do. So where were you when Kennedy was killed? Because I asked her her favorite president, and she said Kennedy was her favorite president. And I said, why was he your favorite president? She said, because he was for coloreds. He was for coloreds. And I said, oh, well, tell me, where were you when Kennedy was killed? And she said, I was in the field. So where were you when you heard about Dr. Martin Luther King? Where were you? And she said, I was in the fields. And I said, wow, so so what did you do? What was your reaction? How were other people responding in the fields? And she says, Mama told us to just keep working. There was nothing we could do about it. And so we had to keep working. There was no need to cry. And so I say that to say, imagine burying all of that down and what that means to someone who is still alive today and well, and all of that pain that she must be carrying because she had to continue moving on. So there's a quote, I don't remember who said this, but I heard someone say, you break my legs, and then you ask why I'd limp. And so I just wanted to, as that first, slide that I shared has pictures of all white women because, the League and the women's suffragette, the suffrage movement was really about women not of color, but white women. Frances Ellen um, Watkins Harper was a suffragette, a Black suffragette. She was an orator. She was a poet, an essayist, a novelist, and a second in her time only to Frederick Douglass, one writer said. And she considered, history has considered her a civil rights leader and a suffragist. She had a stop for people on the Underground Railroad, and she received numerous awards and acclaim. Marianne Shadd Cary, first Black woman in North America to publish a newspaper. And she founded a school for children of freed slaves, taught school by day while attending law school at night. And so what's so important is that every Black woman alive during that time, in some ways, just being alive was fighting and part of the movement. And so when the suffrage movement gained steam in the 1870s after the 15th Amendment was granted voting rights to Black men, she became outspoken for women's rights, including the right to cast a ballot, right? And as we know, what's old is new again. So Shadd Cary said, the crowning glory of American citizenship is that it may be shared equally by people of every nationality, complexion, and sex. That is, yes, we are women. This is a women's organization, and we need our brothers. Mary Church Terrell, many of you probably have heard of her, pushed out of the mainstream suffrage movement by white leaders. She was a Black suffragist through the 1800s. She founded churches, she founded clubs. And one of the reasons that the church is such a rich part of the African American tradition is that it was a place of comfort. It was a place of safety. It was a place of organizing. And it was a place of wholesale acceptance of who you are. So churches historically have been movement home bases for people of color. And Mary Church Terrell was one of the founders of the National Association of Colored Women. She was an educator, a writer, and an organizer, and she also spent quite a bit of time focusing on anti-lynching, Jim Crow segregation, convict leasing, and systems of forced penal labor. Michelle Alexander would say, and the fight continues with the sort of the cradle to grave, the prison pipeline. Okay, Washington, D.C.'s Board of Education is where she spent a lot of time organizing, and she successfully led a campaign to desegregate schools, cities, city hotels, and restaurants. So Mary Church Terrell. Nannie Helen Burroughs was also a feminist, an educator, a suffragist, and she was quite ambitious. I've heard people talk about how she was really an astute businesswoman. She really believed there is no freedom without economic freedom. She believed that women needed to be self-reliant and have economic freedom for themselves. And one of her lasting achievements was launching a national training school for women and girls in Washington, D.C. And in fact, one of the schools that she helped to launch is now a former school that I used to work at, UDC, University of the District of Columbia. Ida B. Wells, many of you have heard of Ida B. Wells and her writing, newspapers, and co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, still thriving, an organization that's thriving today. She was notable for focusing on educating Black women about civics and advocacy and the election of Black political officials. That's one of the things when I am speaking or working with young folks, I'm always encouraging them to run for office, right? Black white, whatever your color. I am encouraging the young people to run for office. We need their voices. And before the May 25th, 2020, we had a negative rap on this generation. And when they showed up and took over all of this country and abroad, the narrative has quickly shifted to saying these folks are willing to work hard for not only people that they care about, but they're willing to work on really hard issues that they care about. They're willing to stand. And one of her quotes was, "I go with you or not at all. I'm not taking this stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my whole race." And the reason why I included Rosa Parks is we all know Rosa Parks' story, but some of us don't, really know it. And she talks about, this slide sort of says, people always talked about how she took a seat on the back of the bus because she was old and tired. And she talks about how it was complete misrepresentation. She was like, I wasn't really old and tired physically. I was 42 years old, plenty of energy as so to speak, but emotionally, mentally, tired of being at the back. And so much of the story has been rewritten. And so I encourage you as part of the work is to continue moving forward with educating yourself on some of the things that we all think we know. I tell folks all the time, knowing is the enemy of learning. And so we must always challenge ourselves to learn. The big six, and this was the six leaders that were noted for doing the work, the bulk of the work for the civil rights movement. These were the leaders. They were all men, six of them: Martin Luther King Jr., James Farmer, John Lewis, Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, and Whitney Young. And I had an opportunity to meet Dr. Haidt a few times. I got a picture with her. I should have included that picture. But one of the times she said, it was a book reading, and she was talking about her book, Open Wide the Freedom Gates. She said they talked about the big six all the time. I was always there. I was not always in the picture, but the big six is a lie, Dr. Haidt says. There were 7 of us. I was in the room. And so, as you can see in that middle caption there, she's looking at Dr. King like, I hope you get this right. I hope you remember what I told you to say and that you don't blow this, okay? And so she recounted, she's like, I was always there. I was always there. And so I just wanted to illustrate the point that women have been working and are always in the room. So where does George Floyd fit in, right? As we talk about all the, COVID, the race relations that was really, really sort of thrust into the limelight by George Floyd's murder, and the mental health pandemic that was already going on, where does George Floyd's story fit in? Basically, it fits in everywhere because this murder was an opportunity to awaken America from what felt like a slumber. If it was a public murder, as you might have heard, Chauvin got the 22 and a half years. Justice has been served, and the fight still continues. And I'm telling you, we're really at an inflection point. We can either get this right and move forward with making sure that every person who has the right to vote gets that unfettered access to a poll, or we slip back. And so Amanda Furge, she is a woman who is in the trenches in the South. She works for the Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative for Economic and Social Justice on intergenerational model building. And she's doing a model building workshop right now. And so this is all about the being able to access people and get to people who ordinarily would not be accessible. And so with this as we think about the work that she's doing and the work that we all have to do in our local communities, right? All politics is local when it gets right down to it. We cannot leave out those people that do not have access to Zoom in the way that we do, that need an Amanda Furge to reach out to them and grab their hands and say, your vote too matters. You count. You mattered. You deserve equal access. You deserve quality care. You deserve quality health care. You deserve quality education. And so this is the work of not just Furge, but many, many others who are in the trenches doing this work. And that includes those of you on this call. Money in politics, right? When I hear people talk about money in politics, what I hear is them talking very globally and systemically. And me and some of the folks in the Black community think cradle to prison pipeline. We think money in politics. We think about the work that we have to do around ensuring that we arrest the patterns that says that 42% of all inmates are Black, while we represent 14% of the population, and what's wrong with that picture, right? We're talking about being able to show up and to arrest those super PACs in their tracks as we deal and address the issues of injustices in this with money and politics. I wanted to put the Dorothea Dix Hospital caption there so that you would also know that, close to my heart is mental health. And this hospital, Dorothea Dix Hospital, St. Elizabeth Hospital in Washington, D.C., was a hospital that was committed to making sure that there was humane treatment. And Dorothea Dix was a lobbyist. She was an advocate for fair and humane treatment, because mental health is also highly, highly politicized. And so every room in St. Elizabeth's had a view of nature, and they were all individual rooms, because people who are mentally ill also deserve nice places to live and places to heal and grow. Redistricting or gerrymandering for poor schools. This is what we hear. When we hear redistricting, we hear poor schools. We hear that there's an attempt to turn back the tide. And as I was thinking about this, and my mother and I, now that we literally can't get away from the news, and she won't let me because she's on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News nonstop. And so my mother said to me the other day, do you know I never had a new textbook? All 12 years of school, I've never had a new textbook. And so when we hear redistricting and gerrymandering, those are the kinds of things that we think about. And for people who think that you can't go back in history, that things can't turn back, you just have to know that things don't get better. People make them better. Okay. And so as a person myself, a Black woman who represents one of only 6% of Black women PhDs, to have a mother to say, I've never had a new textbook, is a source of sadness for me and pride for her, because I am her legacy. And it's because of the work of people like you that are doing the really good work. This is a really quick 2-minute clip. I'm going to start to play it. If it doesn't work, I'm going to turn it off.
She became a leader in the civil rights movement at just 6 years old. Meet Ruby Bridges.
Can you hear it?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Ruby grew up in New Orleans. Her parents, sharecroppers from Tylertown, Mississippi, moved there in the late 50s in search of a better life. The racially divided city had been ordered to integrate its public schools. Ruby would be the first and only Black student to attend William Frantz Elementary. November 14th, 1960 would be Ruby's first day. Federal marshals escorted her to school past the throngs of protesters. Teachers at the school refused to instruct her, and parents kept their children at home until the school provided a separate classroom for white students.
I actually attended this all-white school alone for a whole year. I sat in an empty classroom with a teacher that was white, who came from Boston to teach me, because teachers in New Orleans refused to teach Black children.
Meanwhile, Ruby didn't miss a day of school that year. In 1996, she was reunited with her teacher, Barbara Henry.
was so wonderful to have a little student like Ruby. We had a grand time together, I think, side by side, just the two of us.
Ruby's courage inspired Norman Rockwell to feature her in this iconic painting, which Barack Obama hung outside the Oval Office in 2011.
It's fair to say that if it hadn't been for you guys, I might not be here and we wouldn't be looking at this together.
Once I saw that painting, I realized that there was something much bigger than myself. So I think that sort of put me on my quest to tell my story and to work with kids.
Today, Ruby travels the country speaking to young people, inspiring them, and sharing her truth, which is as relevant today as it was in 1960.
And so I just wanted to share that clip because I found it quite engaging, and it packed a lot of information in that couple of minutes. She didn't consider herself a leader of the civil rights movement as a little girl. She was a 6-year-old girl just trying to get an education. To her mom, she was a daughter. To her friends, she was a friend and a schoolmate. Hatred, bigotry, racism made her a leader. And so as I think about this and I think about that clip, continue to share your truth as
She
well.
became a leader in the civil rights.
Because if you think about how pivotal that moment was, it's just 60 years ago. Can you imagine that? When you talk to Indigenous people and they talk about it takes 4 generations in order to clear or heal a trauma, or continue to perpetuate it if you don't heal. Again, you break my legs and ask me why I limp. Ruby is, last I checked, is still around. And imagine the work that needs to be done in order to heal. So there's so much healing that needs to be done because this was just yesterday in so many ways. And in other ways, it feels like a world away. This is the Little Rock 9. This is another very quick 2-minute video.
What about you, sir? Do you think the colored students will show up? If I got anything to do with it, they won't show up. Well, I think it's a breaking point of the school integration. I just don't feel that they have a right to go to school with them.
It is easy to believe today that we are an enlightened society, free from problems of race, gender, or economic separation. But some of the most difficult lessons we learn are a result of individuals who push us through these divisive barriers. In September of 1957, 9 black school children, the eldest only 17, forced us through such a blockade. They sought a better education for themselves and the opportunity to pursue the American dream.
This is Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. Troops, which for nearly 3 weeks lined the sidewalk here in front of the high school, under orders to keep the colored students out, have been replaced now. And their orders to comply with the law, which means let the Negro students in if they come in.
We were Terrence Roberts, Jefferson Thomas, Thelma Mothershed, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Carlotta Walls, Melba Patillo, Minnie Jean Brown, and Gloria Ray.
They became known as the Little Rock 9. The 1954 Supreme Court ruling on Brown versus the Board of Education found segregation of schools unconstitutional. But as the Little Rock 9 approached the high school, segregationists swarmed the campus.
They got no business out here. This is our school, not theirs. They have their own.
As the violence escalated, one schoolgirl, Elizabeth Eckford, was threatened by an angry mob chanting, "Lynch her, lynch her." President Dwight Eisenhower intervened in Little Rock and set a precedent for our nation as a whole.
Such an extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights in a climate permitting their free and fair exercise. In the present case, the troops are there pursuant to law solely for the purpose of preventing interference with the orders of the court.
On September 25, 1957, the 101st Airborne Division and 10,000 National Guard troops escorted the Little Rock Nine as they walked bravely past screaming mobs and made their way to the classrooms of Little Rock Central High School.
Just got a report here on this end that the students are in.
Do you feel it's worth it going through this?
Yes, I do.
These 9 heroes were willing to step forward and in doing so altered the course of history. Marquette University is honored to bestow upon them the Pierre Marquette Discovery Award.
So, you know what? They did not set out to be heroes. They were young people. They were trying to get an education. They were their mother's children. They were each other's classmates. They were each other's friends. They did not intend to be heroes. History, hatred, bigotry, racism made them civil rights leaders and heroes. And so as I think about this, it feels so recent. And when I hear people say, oh, just get over it. You're always talking about, Black people always bringing up the race card. They always talking about slavery. I bring it up because it's not that long ago. And lest we forget, in this country, we're at an inflection point. And it's really important that we pay attention to our history.
For this
And this is the Little Rock Nine. So I'm going to tell a brief story about this. So this is Miss Eckford, the Black girl who was going to school, and behind her is Miss Bryant. And this has become a really sort of famous caption. There's a story behind this caption. More than 20 years later, they came together to reconcile. Okay. And apparently the reconciliation lasted for a little while. And the reconciliation, this is a before and after. This is a before, this is when they were kids, and now that they're fully grown. The name of this portrait on the side, a picture on the side, was called Reconciliation, Eckford and Bryant in front of Central High School. However, it was initiated because Eckford, the Black woman, received a call from Bryant at age 21, apparently, and they became friends, right, for a short period of time. And eventually they went their separate ways. There's a quote by Eckford that essentially suggests that true reconciliation, here it is, true reconciliation can only occur when we honestly acknowledge our painful but shared past. And that is the reason why so much of my conversations lately have been with folks who want to talk about how to reconcile. How do we reconcile the past? We don't just moving forward is not going to heal this thing. It is not going to heal on its own. Time does not heal, work heals. And so as I think about all of the work that you're doing, it excites me because I know that the original intent of this organization, as we all are, has shifted. It is becoming more inclusive. It is becoming a more compassionate and thoughtful group. And you're standing in the gap and speaking for those voices, for those people who cannot speak, who do not have the language to speak. It is so important that we continue to do that. And so I'm so grateful for all of the work that you continue to do. One of the things, so I just captured this because I really love it. And it makes me think about how marginalized over the years that we have been and how far we've come, and how, invisible we have been over the years, Black women, but how far we've come. And, one of Dr. DeGruy talks about vacant self-esteem is really not knowing who you are creates vacant self-esteem, vacant esteem. And DeGruy says, I'm not who I think I am. I'm not who you think I am. I am who I think you think I am. And that has caused a whole lot of confusion for so many Black people. Honestly, I mean, when you think about history, if you're looking at people of color and thinking, wow, they know something that I don't know. Well, let me tell you right now, there are a lot of Black people who are just figuring this stuff out too. They really are. They're marching in the streets because they didn't realize it was this bad either. When I say we are literally all in this together, this is our shared history. This is our shared past. The trauma and the history of the country is ours to share. The racism as a system of advantage based on race is not about individuals. It is not about individuals. It never has been. It's about a system of advantage that is based on race. And we have to figure out where to go from here. How do we tell the truth? How do we speak even when our voice shakes, according as Audre Lorde might say? No matter how much we think we know, there's always so much more to learn. Self-awareness isn't one truth. It's a delicate balance of two distinct, even competing viewpoints. And the worst thing that we can do is rob people of the memory of themselves. And part of what has happened with Black people in this country, as we have been robbed of the memory of ourselves, we have been robbed of the history of ourselves. I mean, honestly, until I started talking about a lot of this work, my mother did not tell me she had never had a new book in school. Does it matter? I don't know. Maybe not to you, but it kind of matters, right? It's a web of history that is so important for her, her children and her grandchildren to know, not to take freedom for granted, not to take voting for granted, not to take the things that they have for granted, not to take political power, economic power, social power, not to take it for granted. And so I say that to you as well. Tell the truth to your children and your grandchildren. Interview them, interview your oldest living relative as well. Expose them to your history. If we were to interview your oldest relative, what might their story be? Like I interviewed my Aunt May Rose for an hour and 14 minutes. And I tell you what, I could go another hour and 14 minutes learning about her story. Just fascinating stuff. And so for those of you who may know a little bit about research on epigenetics, it's still in line with history. There is evidence now that passing down epigenetics, passing down genetic representation, gene expression for at least 3 generations has been well documented through this research that has been done with mice. Mice were put in a lab and shocked every time the scent of cherry blossoms was presented. The cherry blossom scent was presented, the mice jumped. The mice were shocked. Same cherry blossom scent, the mice were shocked. Well, to test whether they had been encoding this trauma and pairing it with the sense of smell, not only their children, the mice's children, but their grandchildren, when they smell the scent of cherry blossom, they also had trauma reactions in the lab. And so what we know now is epigenetics as a field, the way we pass on generational trauma is real. It's environmental, but yet it's also in our DNA. And this is just a really cute picture of my son in front of the George Floyd Memorial when we went, when we were looking at schools this summer. It was a very solemn place. It was a really politically active place. People were talking and engaging around things that were important. It was right in the middle of the trial, like literally smack dab in the middle. I think we went there on day 17. And it was a really high time in the spirit in terms of the energy of that place. It was super, super solemn and quite spiritual. And I thank you